Welcome to this module on plastic waste management. Did you know that we only started with mass production of plastics in the 1950s, and that all plastics produced until now are still around in stocks, landfills, or the environment, unless they were burnt? Plastics are a very important share of the waste we produce and represent one of the waste fractions with the smallest recycling rates. Most of the managed plastics ends up ultimately in the oceans, where it is fragmented into smaller particles, creating an incredible negative impact in marine life. Microplastics are now global. Plastic particles have been detected in all of the world's oceans, in the ice of the Arctic, and even in several commercial salts and bottled water. So it's time to start taking action on this issue. In this module, you will learn current world plastic flows, including some basics on the sources of marine litter and what plastics are. We will introduce two important features: the source of plastics, whether they are fossil-based or bio-based, and the biodegradability of the material. Here we see how global production of plastic materials have drastically increased since the 50s. We are currently producing more than 340 million tons of plastics per year, which is around half of the global wheat production. Since the 1950s, we have produced around 6,300 million tons of plastics. Only 9% of this has been recycled, while 12% has been incinerated. The remaining 79% has been discarded, and therefore it is accumulated in stocks, landfills, and in the environment. Current estimates say that around 8 million tons of plastics end up in the ocean every year. This is equivalent to a waste truck full of plastics discharging into the ocean every minute. But where is all this marine litter coming from? 20% of the world's marine pollution originates from dumping activities on the water, including vessels, offshore platforms, as well as fishing piers. The remaining 80% originates from land-based sources, 60 to 95% of which is plastic debris. This is clearly caused by unsound waste management practices. Okay, but plastic is an organic material after all. Won't it ever degrade completely? This is a great question, but in order to answer it, we first need to get some background understanding on what plastics exactly are. Plastic is a synthetic material made from organic polymers. A polymer is a large molecule composed of many repeated subunits, called monomers. Here, for instance, we see a PET polymer chain composed of its corresponding monomers. Plastics are usually classified by the chemical structure of the polymer's backbone and side chains, leading to this classification. You might recognize some of these codes in your food packaging. All plastics are then classified into two main groups based on their thermal processing behavior: thermoplastics and thermosets. Thermoplastics can be melted and solidified over and over again, which allows recycling the material, whereas thermosets can only be melted and solidified once. Luckily, thermoplastics represent 80% of all plastics produced. There are two important and often confused features of plastics. On the first hand, we have the nature of the polymers, whether they are fossil-based or bio-based, and on the second hand, we have the biodegradability of the plastics. Let's talk about the nature of the polymers first. Petrochemical or fossil-based plastics are made of fossil feedstocks like petroleum and natural gas, which have taken millions of years to form. The petrochemical industry has been optimizing the synthesis of these plastics since the 1950s. It relies on an efficient production chain and a well-developed distribution system. Comparatively, bio-based plastics are those that entirely or partially derived from biomass, such as plants, trees, or microorganisms. Their advantage is that they avoid the use of fossil fuels to use biomass instead, reducing the product's carbon footprint. The manufacturing industry and logistics chain for these plastics, however, are relatively new compared to that of conventional plastics. Currently, around 1 to 2% of the plastics are bio-based, but it is a fast-growing sector. The second property to mention is the degradability. Pay attention, because this is where the answer to our question comes. The biodegradability of plastics does not depend on whether the polymers are bio-based or fossil-based. It mainly depends on its chemical structure, but also on the thickness of the material as well as environmental conditions such as temperature, moisture, and presence of oxygen. But I'm still not really telling you what biodegradable plastics are, right? Biodegradable plastics are those that can be broken down into their constituent monomers and metabolized into microbial biomass, water, and carbon dioxide through the action of naturally occurring microorganisms such as bacteria and fungi over a short period of time, say from a few weeks to several years. One of the main advantages of biodegradable plastics is that they offer an additional recovery option. Besides the material recovery and energy recovery options, which are also practiced with conventional plastics, biodegradable plastics are also suitable for organic recycling. Let's clarify one thing. Compostable plastics are an example of biodegradable plastics, but they can only be biodegraded under industrial composting conditions, namely elevated temperatures, high relative humidity, and the presence of oxygen. They won't degrade in the natural environment such as on the soil surface or in the oceans. Finally, a few words on oxo-degradable plastics, or rather fragmentable plastics. Oxo-degradable plastics are made from conventional plastics and supplemented with specific additives in order to mimic biodegradation. In truth, however, these additives only facilitate the fragmentation of the materials, breaking them down into smaller fragments, which are most of the times not biodegradable and therefore remain in the environment. The website of the European Bioplastics Association contains numerous resources on bioplastics, as well as oxo-degradable plastics. I just mentioned the term bioplastics, and this is a confusing term, since it is often used to refer to plastics that are bio-based or biodegradable, or both. So it could be everything that is covered now with the green ovals. Therefore, it is better to specify which of the two aspects apply to the given material. That's for now about plastics. In this module, we learned about the current world plastic flows, including some of the basics on the sources of marine litter and what plastics are. We talked about the nature of the polymers, whether they are bio-based or fossil-based, and the biodegradability potential. For further information, please have a look to this key literature.